Greetings from the National Archives. I'm David Ferriero, Archivist of the United States, and it's my pleasure to welcome you to today's virtual book talk with Deborah Willis, author of The Black Civil War Soldier. Before we begin, I'd like to tell you about two upcoming programs you can view on our YouTube channel. On Friday, January 29th at noon, Benjamin R. Justison will discuss his book, Forgotten Legacy. Historians have long overlooked President William McKinley's cooperation with prominent African-American leaders, including George Henry White, the nation's only black congressman between 1897 and 1901. Because of McKinley's dedication to the advancement of African Americans and the safeguarding of their rights as U.S. citizens, he might be considered the first civil rights president. And on Thursday, February 4th at 1 p.m., Alice Baumgardner will tell us about her new book, South to Freedom. In the years before the Civil War, thousands of people in the south-central United States escaped slavery not by heading north, but by crossing the southern border into Mexico. South to Freedom gives us a new perspective on antebellum America and the causes of the Civil War. The Civil War was the first large and prolonged conflict to extensively be recorded in photographs. This visual record gives us a sense of immediacy that we don't have with paintings and prints from the Revolutionary War or other earlier conflicts. We can identify individual faces and we can imagine ourselves on the actual battlefields in the aftermath of the fighting. Thousands of those images are now in the National Archives, but photos of black soldiers are rare. In her book, The Black Civil War Soldier, Deborah Willis shows us the faces of a number of black soldiers who took up arms to fight for their freedom. Using photographs and the written record, she examines not only the individual stories of the soldiers, but also the importance of African American communities during and after the war. Deborah Willis is University Professor and Chair of the Department of Photography and Imaging at the Tisch School of the Arts at New York University and has an affiliated appointment with the College of Arts and Sciences, Department of Social and Cultural Analysis, and Africana Studies. Willis is the author of Envisioning Emancipation and Michelle Obama, both of which received NAACP Image Awards, as well as Posing Beauty. Now let's hear from Deborah Willis. Thank you for joining us today.
Thank you. Welcome and good afternoon, everyone. I'm excited to be here, and I thank the National Archives for this invitation to share my work and inviting me. It's really exciting to consider the work that, a place where I did a lot of work in terms of research at the National Archives, focusing on my topic. My topic also, it's about memory and rediscovery, as well as investigating the legacy of African American soldiers, as well as women and who were teachers and nurses, and to think about how photography, letters, and diaries form this experience. I'm going to start off with sharing my screen, and which will include a talk focusing on my research. And beginning here with the first image, it's the cover of the book. It's an image that celebrates but also documents the experience of image making. This is one of the photographs that is part of the collection that really tells the story of the experience of what it meant to be photographed. And then how do we preserve that photograph through the experience of the casing of the image and the sense of bravery when we read the photograph of this soldier who's holding his gun to his chest. One of the first people who inspired me to think about this project and to encourage the project is the research that I found on Frederick Douglass, his words. So it was the Civil War that inspired Douglass to write and speak on photography. Like many Americans, he believed that photographs and pictures greatly contributed to the succession and a war over slavery. During the Civil War, Douglass wrote a number of lectures. He also had created this sense of man, a sense of commitment to the war. And he wrote, once you, the black man, get upon his person the brass letter US, let him get an eagle on his button and a musket on his shoulder and bullets in his pocket, and there is no power on earth or under earth which can deny that he has earned the right to citizenship in the United States. Finding that quote, and I use it often just in terms of setting the aspect of the visuality of the experience of being photographed. Carrie Mae Weems is also a contemporary artist who is central to my research. So I look, as we think about the missing history of these images, Carrie Mae Weems creates this self-portrait in an antebellum dress styled with a quilt. And she says, I looked and looked to see what so terrified you. She's looking at the history of images of Black people that were made that denigrated and imagined Black bodies as subhuman. And she created this piece in response to J.T. Zealy and Louis Agassiz's research on Black bodies. Also, I just recently discovered this image of a plantation scene. It's entitled Antebellum Tableau by a collector by the name of Sean Nolan. And it's a fascinating story as I try to place the land, place the personal experience, place the memory of the enslavement and also of the Civil War. Here we see a landowner who's standing in the front. We see a post. But the fascinating aspect of this image also is the women, the Black figures in the image. We see a young woman that's straight in the back. She has a bonnet in her hand, and another young girl who is actively posing as if she's sweeping the land. The experience of this, and we think about dress in these images and the importance of land and family stories. This finding these images and meeting, when I was researching this story, I was looking for ways to tell how photography mediated with the silencing of this history by going into public and private collections to find another narrative. And this is a portrait of Richard Etheridge. It's hand tinted, as you can see. It's a carte de visite. And he writes a letter to his former captain, Orrin Hedrick. I have the honor to tend here with my regards for the future of your welfare, trusting that in the days to come, that we'll get a chance to say hello and thank you again. This is an important moment because this is the exchange between a man who was born into slavery, who fought in the war, and he was enlisted in the 36th U.S. Colored Infantry in 1863, and he worked and he fought in Petersburg, Newmarket Heights, and had a relationship that was healthy with the captain. And also why I'm excited about the talk here at the National Archives is that I researched the National Archives through the pension records, trying to find stories about Black soldiers and their families and their experiences. This is a portrait of Henry Brewster that's in the archives. It's probably about 1870, where his wife in 1905, Susan Brewster, sent her only photograph of her husband requesting its return, and we see it still in the archive. That the photograph is there in the Department of Interior, in the archives when she sent the letter. She's asking for the return because this is the only image that Henry was a blacksmith and a laborer and a tailor. He fought in the war. He was injured. And she wrote, and she had a number of affidavits proving her marriage to Brewster, but also citing that he lost his sight in his eye, in his right eye, and he had kidney problems after he left the Army. She was trying to get his pension. So there are a number of letters in the pension records where Black women are trying to survive after their husband's death. Unfortunately, she never received his pension, but her letter remains and her affidavits remain legible in terms of telling this story. And visualizing that experience, we see it through this photograph of Henry Brewster, who's posing in the studio. Another figure that's central to the women in the war is the washerwomen. The washerwomen are central to this story as we think about the experience of men who fought, who also, we were thinking about sanitary situations in the war where most of the men, many of the men who died, they died because of the experience not only of the bullet wounds, but because of unsanitary conditions. And the experience of washerwomen who also washed the clothes of the men and the soldiers, and they tried to create a safe space and sanitary space for the soldiers. Here is a woman who's unidentified, and it's in the Smithsonian's collection, and she's posed with an American flag pinned to her chest with the U.S. brass button. And we see the photographer in terms of relationships as we think about the importance of how the photographer's hand is necessary in creating the importance of the image. Images that are hand tinted really give life to an image, and it tells a story of one man who's unidentified here, standing in front of a painted backdrop. So we see the importance of art in history making. We see the importance of art as a narrative of telling a story of bravery. When we see the American flag that is hand tinted, we also see the battlefields, we see the battlegrounds, we see the instruments of war. And the photographer imagines, as the photographer sees himself as posing ready for war, ready to fight for freedom, not only for himself, but for others. And a photographer and a family member, and also another image of a soldier with his family seated with his children, and knowing that this image is a central way of creating a narrative of the importance of family. Women wrote letters to their husbands, and it's really, as I tell this story, I think about the experience of women who wrote to Abraham Lincoln about equal pay, not only the wives and mothers, but soldiers as well. As they fought, they understood their presence, their importance, and so in terms of these portraits, they were central in circulating the humanity of these subjects. So here, this is in a private collection of a collector, Greg French, and we see these two posed images. One, of course, it's as lovely as its gold highlights on the tintype. And so again, as the artist, the photographer is using ways to enhance the story, enhance the humanity of the portraits. So letters such as this letter that I found, it's really important to think. She starts off in 1863 and she writes, "My dear husband, I received your last letter." And then ending up, I say, tell Isaac that his mother and others got clothing that they sent. So there's an exchange of community when we see this letter from Martha. "Farewell, my dear husband, from your wife," asking him to write soon, to experience these moments of gratitude about the war, but also worried about the experience of their children and other people in the community that they left. This is a image of the 127th Ohio Regiment, later called the 5th U.S. Colored Troop in Ohio. And as they're about to go to war, we see a group of people standing on the street, bearing witness to the experience of these soldiers. And in terms of the war and the importance of history, Barbara Krauthammer and I, when we created and worked on the book, Envisioning Emancipation, we wanted to think about self-emancipated people, women and men who are also known as curious as runaway. And this is a, quote, runaway ad from Louis Manicault plantation and his papers. And this is where he highlights he's a $50 reward for a woman by the name of Dolly. And we see that he says ran away from the yard corner of Jackson and Broad in Augusta, Georgia, on the date of 7 April 1863, the woman Dolly, whose likeness is seen here. She's 30 years of age, light complexion, hesitates somewhat when spoken, and with a fine set of teeth, but rather good looking and not healthy. So his letter, implicates her good looks, that she's free, that she ran away, but she was enticed off, as they said here, by a white man. And as research has, subsequent research has shared, that it could have been a Union soldier, it could have been her lover. So there are different stories, and there's here a photograph of Louis Manacle in South Carolina. Portrait of Susie King Taylor is thinking about the aspect of Susie King Taylor and her diary in her book. She understood that soldiers desired to communicate with their loved ones and to write letters. And she says, I taught a great many of the comrades in Company E to read and write when they were off duty. Nearly all were anxious to learn. And also her husband also worked with her on that. This is a fantastic image in the scene in Beaufort, South Carolina, with a regiment as entitled composed of quote, escaped slaves in formation. We see the land, we see the importance of this image and the rarity of space. But the comportment of the pose of the men in uniform says a lot about the next step, where they were prepared to move forward. And I'm going to walk through some images here that we rarely see, but we see in private collections, and the importance of photography, and how the picture gallery was a central place for the soldiers to enter, safe place to create a sense of identity and to create an image of soldiers who were on a mission to create a story about the fight for freedom. This is a group of soldiers in Port Hudson, Louisiana, and this is the Provost Marshal office in Port Hudson. Outside, we see the range of people. We see soldiers, we see men and women who are standing outside. In terms of dress, we see that some are known as called contraband, as they were seen as they're entering into a space of freedom and moving out of slavery. And these are images where we begin to see a narrative again of masculinity that countered the negative images that were presented of Black people, of Black men, that had the demeaning images that circulated of Black figures. So we see a sense of nation building and citizenship with these images. There are images in the collection, in the book, of Abraham Lincoln, with some of the generals that we know in history, to an image here of Nicholas Biddle, who is from Pennsylvania, in Pottsville, Pennsylvania, who in 1861 is known as the first wounded man in the Great American Rebellion, 1861, April 18th. And he was wounded in Baltimore when there were a group of men, company militia, volunteer militia from Pennsylvania. They marched through the city of Baltimore on their way to defend the Capitol in Washington, D.C. It's an important moment to see this image, because Biddle, who was injured, he was called names and rocks were thrown, and he was hit on the head by one of the rocks and was bleeding. And we can see after the war, he visited a photographer's studio in his uniform with the handkerchief that he used to wipe the blood off of his face. And so here again, we see the aspect of creating identity, creating a biography through the experience of being photographed and remembering, as I mentioned earlier, that memory, personal and public, is central to creating these images. We have sailors. We also have journalists. And in the book, when I began the research, I wanted to to have firsthand accounts of soldiers, as well as their letters, but also journalists who wrote about the experience of witnessing the war. And this is by William H. Johnson. Prior to Black people entering the war, he was able to write about the experience, and he was a war correspondent for the Pine and Palm during the first year of the Civil War. And he wrote a number of amazing articles that visualize the Union's experience and the sense of bravery that meant to most of them. He also talked about the loss and what happened through this experience. Another figure, Alexander Heritage Newton, and his image here, this is in the collection of the Beinecke Library, but Newton also wrote about his experience in the war, and as well as his enslaved experience, as well as helping people through the Underground Railroad. And he says, I was born under the regime of slavery, a free child, my mother being a free woman. My father was a slave, so that in my family, I learned what slavery was firsthand. I felt it's cursed in my bones, and I longed for an opportunity and the power to play the role of Moses on behalf of my people. So in terms of that, and just the poetics of his language and writing, helps guide even the pose of his image, as we see, and he's on the left, and we see that experience. He also writes about the experience of the Colored Orphan Asylum in 1861. As we all know that during the time this was burned down in New York, and this battle about Black people, part of the that whites were joining the war, fighting the war, and Blacks needed to be a part of this experience and wanted to be a part of this experience. There was a soldier by the name of James Gooding who lived in the orphanage in 1846. And so he joined the 54th Mass, and he wrote also a letter and books about the experience. And he also wrote the experience that he had 48 letters in the New Bedford Mercury about the war from 1863 to 1864. Images here is titled Contraband. And here we see the 13th Mass. We see women. We see a woman who's pregnant. We see a young woman, the pregnant woman, who has her arm wrapped around possibly her mother or an older woman. The older woman who removes her bonnet from her head to be photographed, and the range of people in this image, from children to older people to nurses to men wearing suits and jackets. And so we begin to see the formation of the experience of people who were seeking their freedom. This is African-American hospital workers, including the nurses in Nashville, Tennessee. And this famous, well-documented image of Gordon, who was, titled The Scourged Back, and it was used by the abolitionists. And there's a man in Scotland who says that I found a large number of the 400 contrabands examined by me as badly lacerated as a specimen represented in this enclosed photograph. So traveling through Boston, this person, Scottish scholar John Francis Campbell, he actually purchased this, as he says, a pro-Lincoln political photograph. And we see the text on the back of this image by Colonel Marsh, John W. Mercer, who writes the experience about this surgeon who assisted in the care of Gordon. So when I think about the range of experience of Gordon as he entered the camp and how his image circulated and his story circulated in different ways, we see that it was in the Harper's Weekly as a story of a typical Negro fighting for his freedom as he entered the camp in ragged clothes, showing and posing the lacerated back to wearing the uniform. And so when we again see the range of experience. to a Confederate soldier with Sergeant Chandler from the 44th Mississippi, to Silas Chandler, who was his servant, who was freed, and then continued to stay with the sergeant when he was wounded. Images of mothers and family members and wives, their role played heavily in the visualizing women. And Tara Hunter writes, while women asserted claims of citizen wife or soldier's wife, they were not readily granted either. And yet they carefully chosen self-descriptions to find how they were at once vital to and undervalued by the Union. So this speaks a lot about how women played their role and visualizing their experience in constructing their stories and their memory about using photograph as memorializing this experience. Images of soldiers, just a Rhode Island carte de visite, women again in terms of teachers, as we think of Harriet Jacobs in her school in Alexandria, Virginia. She says, I must say one word about our school, and she talks about the children and the importance of the scholars in the community, and she was concerned about the health of her daughter. These are all significant ways of how we read images of contraband, images of men and women and children who were enslaved. This is another image here of the Smith plantation in Beaufort, South Carolina. Images of Harriet Tubman and significant images of the call for men and women to join the war by Frederick Douglass. So here, as I move forward and considering our time, looking at the posing of the experience of the quiet moment of going into the studio, here is Colonel Shaw, who was head of the 54th. And we know before he left that he is posed considering the next steps. And he says, we have gone quietly along forming the regiment as he prepares for the war and how long it takes to get to South Carolina as they prepare for the war. This is an album at the Smithsonian, and we see that it's part of the gift of the Garrison family, the memory of George Thompson Garrison. And this is an album. And as I mentioned before, how the soldiers also entered in studios, the captains and other servicemen created albums of the people in their camps. And here, this is the outside of the album. The album is bound in gold leather in terms of the gold leaf clasps, but we see the power of images, and they're compelled to tell me the stories, to push forward, to tell the story from William Carney with his flag in terms of his image, what he used throughout his lifetime of the importance of the war in his story. The narrative of history lessons, as we think of portraits, this portrait of Charles Douglas, who's Frederick Douglass's son, who after his father sent the call to arms, colored men call to arms, that this is a way of looking at his history, posing as before he enters into the war, but the pose as he's prepared to fight with his brother, Lewis Douglass, who has a number of letters in exchange with his fiancée, Amelia. And one, he writes, he posed for the photographer in Boston. His photograph is in Howard University, Moreland Spingarn letter collection. But he says, I've been in 2 fights and I'm unhurt. I believe we'll have another fight tonight. He says, if I survive, I shall write you a long letter. And then he describes the people who were wounded from her city in upstate New York. And then he writes another, my dear girl, while I am away, do not fret yourself to death. Oh, I beg of you, do not. So he's also concerned about her life, her concerns. And his fiancée, he talks also about the experience of the welfare of the men in the camp. He talks about the loss of the 3 who died in Fort Wagner. And these are experiences that give life to the images that breathe life into the images as they weave a story about the history of the not only the iconic moments, but also the Southern landscape, and how letter writing and slave narratives were important in creating my story that I was fascinated with. And here's a letter by Amelia. She says, "My dear Lewis, I was very glad to receive yours. I expected to hear from you. I heard that you were ill." So and then her photograph, hand tinted photograph, when we began to see these experiences of women, how they envision themselves. Charlotte Fortin's journal, she has a wonderful diary of her experience when she met Robert Shaw. And he came to take tea with us, and afterwards they stayed to the Shout, which was a religious meeting, and he was really excited about the experience of going to a praise house to see the, quote, shout, as she describes. And she was delighted to find that he was one of the very best and most spirited that he had men that he had met. She says that Colonel Shaw looked and listened with the deepest interest. And so he expressed his gratitude for inviting him to the Shout. But as I mentioned, again, as we think about this is a portrait of Henry Stewart, and he's part of the 54th Mass, and he is, this is a photograph in the Historical Society of Massachusetts. Disease was the number one killer of many of the combatants during the war. And that he was a non-commissioned officer, as many, and Stewart was actively engaged in recruiting of soldiers in the regiment. He died of disease at the regiment hospital in Morris Island on 27 September 1863, and his estate was paid $50. So the sad story, he was only in the war less than 6 months and died. He was a recruiter, and unfortunately, the stories that he experienced through the unsanitary experiences. And here is a portrait of Christian Fleetwood. He writes that Fleetwood. He writes it from Carroll County, Maryland, and I get excited about some of these stories because I love the fact that issued a forage cap or a kepi bearing a brass bugle above it, the number 4, a uniform coat, dark blue wool, and an overcoat, 1 pair of light blue woolen trousers, a booty, 2 shirts, a knapsack, a canteen. These are and a blanket. So when we see this, when the soldiers were handed these items, that they could write a note up at break of dawn, under the supervision of the camp, and the experience of what it meant. So every day, these little hand diaries that you can hold in your palm of your hand and write a little note about the experience. They were portable. They weren't large, but he wrote about the meals and what the pickets and what was going on up front. And then the best discovery was Jill Newmark's research on Black surgeons. And she had an exhibition at NIH. And here is a photograph of Anderson Abbott. And he was appointed an acting assistant surgeon in 1863. And he worked at the Freedmen's Hospital, which is also the Contraband Hospital, during the war. And so we see his photograph. It was in the collection in Baltimore. We see another surgeon, and he writes about the experience on the 14th, the most eventful event of my life occurred. I drew $100, less war tax $250 for medical services rendered to the U.S. government. My draft was in favor of assistant surgeon rank first lieutenant. I read the address several times, and I liked it. I confess it read strange to me, though it read strange to me. So reading that he was paid a certain amount of money, even though he didn't like the experience of the war, but he was there to take care of some of the wounded men. and that experience of wearing his uniform. Another, Alexander Augusta, who also wrote to President Lincoln, saying he intended to apply for an appointment to become a surgeon for the freedmen. And he says, I was compelled to leave. He left his country to live in Canada, to study medicine, but he returned to be a part of this experience of the war. And here's his photograph and his letter. We see Sojourner Truth part of this, and another group of photographs by white officers who photographed some of their the men in their camp. And we see ranges of images of photographs that tell a different story. A marriage certificate. W.B. Du Bois organized an exhibition in 1900 of the Medal of Honor men who were part of the Civil War, and he put that in an exhibition in Paris. And this is a photograph that was on display there. An important image that's at George Eastman House, where Lewis Hine photographed a family in their home. And above the fireplace is the Fort Wagner, a drawing of the Fort Wagner unfortunate death of all of the men who died, including Shaw. And we see this as a part of the artwork on the wall, and we see the importance of the memory of that experience. And contemporary artists such as Wendell White, looking at the history of these images and the experience of the images that are in the archives, and he's making contemporary images about these experiences. The notion of the Grand Army of the Republic, the veterans of the war. This is a parade in May 30th, 1912 in the Blockson Collection at Temple University. Young women and men walking with their grandfathers and fathers marching through the streets. Carrie Mae Weems, another artist who's also looking at that experience of the war and making art about it. And she photographed the monument in Boston. And here it's titled, Restless After the Longest Winter, You Marched and Marched. And from that experience, Carrie is looking at the experience of an artist who used this story to recreate the monument and to dramatize the long marches, the cold winters, and photographing this at a time when the 54th left the city. And it says that at the 54th Regiment, marching down Beacon Street on May 28, 1863, they left Boston to head south. Weems focuses on one soldier in this big monument, and she says that, because of the looking at these images in the tarnished winters and the experience of the artwork changing as a result of the elements, it looks as there's sweat rolling and falling down the soldier's face. And the way that this brings life to the experiences of contemporary artists who are looking at the war, such as William Earl Williams's image of Sergeant Carney Monument in Norfolk, Virginia, that was built and by Black people in that town. And then Linda Ford Roberts, as she's photographing in North Carolina and thinking about death as well as the experience of the burial grounds that divided in death and divided in life. And here we see the two sides of a cemetery. And then ending with images of women who worked for the Union and the Confederate hospitals. They were nurses and cooks and laundrywomen. And here are some photographs that are in collections. And one of my, I really love this image as in Arlington House as a way of the responding to looking at this image. And this is a Selena Norris Gray's image, that she was, when she fled, when Robert Lee left the house, and here we see she is credited with saving some Union soldiers and saving some of the heirlooms from belonging to George Washington that were stored in the house. So has this complicated role in history where she's working with both sides and at the same time understanding the role that she has in history. By looking at this photograph, we see her with these two young figures, but dress, again, is a central story in this. So I'm going to stop sharing the screen and open up for questions. So just checking the chat. Okay, so there are no audience questions at this time. And this work for me in terms of the experience of this wonderful, let's say 10-year research follows a long history of, 4 years, we think about the war, but I'm amazed at the research that we see that gives life to these powerful images. Just seeing the struggle that Black people had in terms of fighting to be part of this equality, wanting to be free, and the importance that their words and their images are preserved. They're preserved at the National Archives, and in terms of that experience, but also their crucial stories, as well as these images of these fantastic works by the photographers, as these artists knew the importance of the worthiness of these soldiers and fighters and cooks and nurses, the sense of what it meant to be free and what it meant to personalize their experience through the visual image. And so I guess now that we have no questions, and I'd like to end and just think about for us to imagine what photography meant in this. Photography was basically 20 some odd years old when the war started, and to create this long visual history as visual evidence of the Black presence was an important role that photography played. So in terms of the multiple lessons that we learn through history, I see the visual experience as telling that story. And thank you.